Welcome back to this next video in which we are discussing multiple sclerosis. Okay, so we're currently in the process of discussing the pathophysiology of multiple sclerosis, or what is believed to be the pathophysiology of multiple sclerosis. And what we have discussed so far is that multiple sclerosis is believed to be an autoimmune disease in which the immune response is going to attack a protein of the myelin sheath of the central nervous system. So what we have seen is that in the central nervous system, myelin sheaths are produced by cells called oligodendrocytes, which are another cell type that is present within the brain and spinal cord tissue. So there's not just nerve cells within the brain and spinal cord, there are other cell types as well. Oligodendrocytes are a major cell type that's present there. Whereas, in the peripheral nervous system, myelin sheaths are produced by Schwann cells. Now, very importantly to understand is the fact that the myelin produced by Schwann cells is not exactly the same as the myelin that's produced by oligodendrocytes. In particular, the special proteins that are amongst the lipids in the myelin sheath are different in peripheral nervous system myelin compared to central nervous system myelin. Even more in particular, there are proteins in the central nervous system myelin sheaths that are not present in the peripheral nervous system myelin sheaths. And we believe that multiple sclerosis is an autoimmune attack against one of these special proteins in the myelin of the central nervous system that is not present within the myelin of the peripheral nervous system. The identity of that protein is still currently unknown. There are loads of proteins in the myelin sheaths of the central nervous system myelin that are not present within peripheral nervous system myelin sheaths. We do not know which one of those is the specific one that's attacked in multiple sclerosis at present. It may be the case that in different individuals with multiple sclerosis, it's a different one of these central nervous system myelin proteins that's being attacked. It might not be the case that in every person who's got multiple sclerosis, the autoimmune attack is directed against the exact same protein, but we just don't know the answer to these sort of questions at the moment. So the limit of our knowledge at present is that one of these proteins that is present just within central nervous system myelin and is not present within peripheral nervous system myelin is going to be attacked by an autoimmune attack in multiple sclerosis. Now, before we begin the story of how this is actually going to come to be, let me just say that we talked in the previous video about these different types of multiple sclerosis. We talked about the fact that there is something called a clinically isolated syndrome, which is where you just get a single episode of white matter lesion formation. And then we talked about those different forms of multiple sclerosis, the relapsing remitting multiple sclerosis, the primary progressive multiple sclerosis, and the secondary progressive multiple sclerosis. We believe, at least at present, that as far as the autoimmune attack is concerned, the pathophysiology is the same for all of those four different things, clinical isolated syndrome and the three different types of multiple sclerosis. So we believe that what I'm saying is the same for all of them, i.e. that all of them are caused by an autoimmune attack on central nervous system myelin proteins. What's different between them is, in the case of clinically isolated syndrome versus multiple sclerosis, how many actual episodes of white matter lesions you get formed, and in the case of the different types of multiple sclerosis, how well the white matter lesions are actually going to heal. As far as what is actually happening to cause the lesion to form, we believe that the pathophysiology is the same in those different four scenarios. Okay, so what we're going to say applies to all of them, and we'll come back later on to discuss or to emphasize how they differ apart from one another. Okay, so let's begin then now. So I'll put the title here. We're now going to have a look at the story of how this autoimmune attack on central nervous system myelin proteins is believed to come about. So, let's start off then with a person who's going to develop multiple sclerosis. So I'm just going to draw a little person here who's going to get multiple sclerosis. Let's say it's a man. So let's say this man is going to develop multiple sclerosis. How does he develop multiple sclerosis? What happens inside his body that doesn't happen in the body of someone who's not going to develop multiple sclerosis that leads to him getting multiple sclerosis? That's what we want to know. So, multiple sclerosis is quite rare. 1 in 500 people suffer from multiple sclerosis. What is going to be different about this individual who's going to get multiple sclerosis compared to the other 499 people who aren't going to get multiple sclerosis? Well, we don't really know exactly the answer to that yet. It's obviously a question that is really important. Why does he get this? But at present, we don't really know what the etiological factors are. Most definitely genetics are going to play a role, but also environmental factors are going to play a role. And these genetic factors and these environmental factors, what they are going to lead to, the problem that's fundamentally going to occur is in his immune system. His immune system is going to develop the ability to attack this central nervous system myelin protein that it should not acquire the ability to attack. And that ability is something that his immune system is going to acquire for genetic and environmental factors that we don't fully understand, and which all the people who aren't going to develop multiple sclerosis will not develop that way. Their immune systems will not develop that capacity. So, obviously, we're going to have to talk a little bit about the immune system to understand multiple sclerosis. So this is the point where I'm going to now give you a little bit of an introduction to the immune system. So, we're going to discuss the immune system. So, of course, I've said it already, the immune system is our way of defending the body against pathogens, little microorganisms that would like to infect the body and use it for their own means to replicate themselves. Now, the immune system, you can divide it up into 2 major arms, and it's important that we have a good understanding of this. So the 2 major arms of the immune system are the innate immune system and also the adaptive immune system. Now, there's another word that we use to describe the innate immune system, which is to call it the inflammatory response. Now, when a white matter lesion forms in multiple sclerosis, I've already used this term inflammation. I've told you that inflammation is occurring at the site where that white matter lesion is occurring. So clearly the innate immune system has been involved in creating that white matter lesion, and indeed it is. However, it's actually going to be the adaptive immune system that goes wrong first in multiple sclerosis. So let me take a step back and just explain what the difference between the innate immune system and the adaptive immune system is. So the innate immune system is less sophisticated but is incredibly powerful. The innate immune system consists of loads of proteins that are within the blood usually, and which are capable of attacking pathogens. The classic example of these proteins are complement proteins, produced by the liver and which are circulating in the bloodstream, and which, in response to a pathogen being present in a certain piece of tissue, you can recruit these proteins from the blood into that tissue and they can attack the pathogen. So I'll just write a little bit of this down. I'll change colour again to keep it looking interesting. So the innate immune system consists of proteins within the bloodstream, okay, which can be recruited to a site where there is a pathogen by a response of the microvasculature, which we call the inflammatory response, and which can come in and try and attack pathogens. In addition, it consists of lots of white blood cells that are circulating within the bloodstream, which can also be recruited from the bloodstream into a site where a pathogen is present to attack that pathogen. So there are special types of white blood cells that are involved in the innate immune system. And the 2 major types of circulating white blood cells that are involved in the innate immune system are neutrophils, which are a type of phagocyte, which means that they come into tissues and they basically eat pathogens. They engulf the pathogens, they phagocytose pathogens is the fancy way of putting it, and then they break down those pathogens. And then circulating in the bloodstream, you also have monocytes, which are the precursors to macrophages. So monocytes are the circulating form, and then once they've been recruited out of the bloodstream into tissue, they become macrophages. They change their shape, they become much bigger and blobbier, and they're then known as macrophages. And for short, we often abbreviate macrophages down to M5s. And we'll discuss these two types of white blood cells later on in more detail. Macrophages too are a phagocyte. They engulf pathogens and break them down. Now, all of these mechanisms, proteins and these types of white blood cells, these parts of the innate immune system, the reason they are referred to as the innate immune system is that they are the same response no matter what the pathogen is. They are not specific to the pathogen at all. They're a very crude immune mechanism. These proteins and these white blood cells are capable of attacking a huge number of different pathogens, and the way that they do it is exactly the same no matter what type of pathogen you're dealing with, whether you're dealing with a virus, whether you're dealing with a bacterium, whether you're dealing with a fungal cell, or whether you're dealing with a multicellular parasite. The innate immune response, the inflammatory response, is exactly the same. If a pathogen is present within a tissue, what happens is the microvasculature, which is the tiny little blood vessels in that tissue, start opening up. They allow proteins from the bloodstream to come into that tissue to attack the pathogen, and they also start recruiting these two major forms of white blood cells, neutrophils and macrophages, into the tissue to attack the pathogen. And this response is not specific at all to what pathogen you're dealing with. It's the exact same response no matter what type of pathogen you're dealing with. It's a very powerful response, but do realize that it is a response that isn't specific at all to the pathogen. Now, this is the normal immune response, the normal branch of the immune response that goes first. If, for instance, you had a pathogen within the brain, okay, a very, very horrible illness, if you had an infection within the brain, what the first part of the immune system that would attack that is the innate immune system, the inflammatory response. You'd bring in proteins from the blood, and you'd bring in these types of white blood cells into that tissue, and they would try their best to attack the pathogen, and they might succeed in clearing it on their own. It is a very powerful response. The brilliant thing about it is that it is powerful, and it's very, very quick because it's not specific at all to the pathogen that we're dealing with. The bad thing is that it's not specific to the pathogen that we're dealing with, and in some cases it might not be strong enough on its own to actually deal with certain types of pathogens. So, normally, when we're actually dealing with a pathogen rather than autoimmune disease, it's the innate immune response that goes first. Now, of course, the innate immune response is not going to attack your own tissues. It's initiated in response to pathogens being present in tissue. And pathogens, remember, will have a whole bunch of molecules associated with them that no human cell in its right mind would ever create. And we recognize those molecules that are associated with pathogens and initiate the inflammatory response. So it's these horrible molecules that pathogens have that no human cell would ever have that initiate the innate immune response. No self-protein will cause the initiation of the innate immune response. So, in an autoimmune disease, it is not going to be the innate immune response that goes first. It's going to be the adaptive immune response that goes first, and then it's going to bring the innate immune response in to attack on its orders, basically. So the adaptive immune response is specific to the type of pathogen that you are dealing with, and it usually, if we're dealing with a pathogen, goes second after the innate immune response. It takes a while to come on and will come on much later. However, we're not dealing with a pathogen in the case of multiple sclerosis. We're dealing with an autoimmune attack, and it's going to be the adaptive immune response that goes first in an autoimmune disease, and then it's going to order the innate immune response to attack after it has attacked. So, let me now then talk about the adaptive immune response then. So, another colour then, we will have red, I think. So, the adaptive immune response is an immune response that is specific to the type of pathogen that you are dealing with, and it is usually initiated after the innate immune response if you had an infection. So for instance, if you did have an infection in the brain, you would initiate adaptive immune responses against that pathogen. In autoimmune diseases, not just multiple sclerosis, but other autoimmune diseases as well, it's the adaptive immune system that's going to develop aberrantly so that it then is capable of attacking your own tissues. It shouldn't be capable of attacking your own tissues, but if you're going to develop an autoimmune disease, it is capable. And I'm afraid it's very powerful, the adaptive immune response. It can cause the innate immune response to attack. It can give orders for the innate immune response to attack, and we'll see this later on. So let's talk about what cells are involved in the adaptive immune response. So the adaptive immune system consists of two major types of cells, namely T cells and B cells. And you have a huge number of T cells and B cells within your body. I should say, just going back to the cells of the innate immune system, neutrophils and monocytes, you have a huge number of these in your body as well. They're circulating within your bloodstream, and you are continuously producing more neutrophils and monocytes within the bone marrow all the time to replace the ones that you are losing. In particular, neutrophils have a very short half-life. They die very quickly, so you're continuously producing more of these very basic cells of the immune system. Also, the liver's continuously producing proteins as part of the innate immune response that it's putting into the blood. So this immune system is continuously being rebuilt, basically. The innate one's continuously being regenerated, and it can be regenerated very, very simply because of the fact that these cells are very basic. They're not special cells at all. Whereas, coming on to the adaptive immune system, the populations of T cells and B cells, these are very, very difficult to produce. They are very, very special. All of the different T cells and all of the different B cells are slightly different. So the adaptive immune system is much more complicated to understand, and it's much more complicated to build. So you have these two populations of cells, T cells and B cells, and you have a huge number of these cells within your body, and most of them are present within the lymph nodes of your body. So they sit within lymph nodes in your body, also within the spleen, which is a massive lymphoid organ. So you have a lot of T cells and a lot of B cells, billions in fact of these within your body, and they're sitting within the lymph nodes. Some of them will, and other lymphoid tissue. Some of them will be in the bloodstream at any one time. They don't sit in the lymph nodes forever. They move out of the lymph nodes, go into the bloodstream for a while, and then might go to a different lymph node. So they move around the body, and they live for an incredibly long time. Okay, so when a T cell or B cell has never ever been used before, we call it a naive T cell or a naive B cell. So we're going to start by talking about naive T cells and naive B cells, which are the ones that are produced by the bone marrow, mainly during childhood, especially in the case of the T cells, and which have not actually been used ever before in your life. Now, before we actually discuss something extremely important, let me say that there are two major populations of T cells. So the great big population of T cells, we split them into two categories. There are the CD4 positive T cells, and then there are the CD8 positive T cells. So if you look at all the T cells that you've got in your body, you can divide them into these two categories, the CD4 positive T cells and the CD8 positive T cells. We can also refer to the CD4 positive T cells as the helper T cells, or T subscript H. So this is for helper. And we can also refer to the CD8 positive T cells as the cytotoxic T cells, or the T subscript C T cells. So I'll just actually put these names here as well. So these are the helper T cells, and these are the cytotoxic T cells. Okay, so let's talk about what these three populations of cells are involved in doing then. The CD4 positive T cells, the CD8 positive T cells, and the B cells. So, the ones that are going to be important in multiple sclerosis are the CD4 positive T cells and the B cells. we do not believe that the CD8 positive T cells are particularly important in multiple sclerosis. At present, we believe it's the CD4 positive T cells and the B cells that are important in multiple sclerosis. Now, let me just briefly say that with regards to the adaptive immune system, you can split the adaptive immune system into two major arms. One arm involves the CD4 positive T cells and the B cells, and the other arm involves the CD8 positive T cells. So let me just put some boxes around these. So the CD4 positive T cells here, or the helper T cells, they actually form an arm of the adaptive immune system with the B cells. And the CD8 positive T cells, they form another arm of the adaptive immune system on their own. Now, this is the reason that the helper T cells are called helper T cells, because they work with the B cells. So let me tell you, or try and give you some motivation about these two different arms of the adaptive immune system, and clearly it's the one that I've boxed in green that's important in multiple sclerosis. The CD4 positive T cells and the B cells, these are majorly involved in destroying extracellular pathogens. So extracellular arm. Whereas the CD8 positive T cell arm of the adaptive immune system, and I'll find another interesting colour, we'll have it in blue here. This arm of the adaptive immune system, this is what we might call the intracellular arm of the adaptive immune system. So I'll say this again. We can split the adaptive immune system into these two major different types of responses. There is the response to an extracellular pathogen, which is a pathogen that is in the extracellular fluid. It's a pathogen that is invading your body. It has infected your body, but at least it's not actually inside your own cells. It's an extracellular pathogen. It's swimming amongst the extracellular fluid around your cells, but it's not actually inside your cells. Whereas, of course, an intracellular pathogen would be a pathogen that's actually done worse, if you like. It's not just inside your body, it's actually inside your cells. It's gone inside your cells. So, of course, the major example of intracellular pathogens would be viruses. Viruses have to go inside your cells to use the cellular machinery to replicate themselves. Whereas a lot of bacterial infections would be extracellular infections, and fungal infections would be generally extracellular infections as well. So, if you are dealing with a pathogen that is extracellular, you initiate this arm of the adaptive immune system. You need the CD4 positive T cell response along with a B cell response. Whereas if you're fighting an intracellular pathogen, the type of adaptive immune system response that you're going to use is going to be the CD8 positive T cell response, the intracellular response. Okay, so in multiple sclerosis, the type of response that's going to be initiated is this extracellular response. CD4 positive T cells are going to be involved and B cells are going to be involved. Now, we will stop talking then about CD8 positive T cells. We're going to forget these ones. We're just going to now talk about CD4 positive T cells and B cells that are going to form this extracellular arm of the adaptive immune response. So, very, very complicated piece of information coming up, and this is why the adaptive immune system is so complicated, because of what I'm about to tell you. I'm going to draw some pictures to try and help explain this. So we'll have a picture of a CD4 positive T cell, and we'll have a picture of a B cell as well. So here is going to be our CD4 positive T cell in vivid purple here, and remember, naive T cells and B cells are going to have very, very large nuclei and very little cytoplasm. So this is going to be our CD4 positive T cell, or our helper T cell. So I'll put him as a TH cell here. Okay, so in your body, you're going to have absolutely a huge number of these helper T cells that are going to be present within your lymph nodes and other lymphoid organs and other lymphoid aggregates. So for instance, I've just remembered that along the gastrointestinal tract there are loads of lymphoid aggregates. In the ileum they're called Peyer's patches. So in the wall of the intestine you have lots of lymphoid aggregates where loads of T cells and B cells are stored. So in the body, there's loads of places where T and B cells like to hang out when they're not in the blood, and most of them are sitting in these lymphoid aggregates, all together nice and cozy. So, you have a massive, great population of helper T cells, and here's the complicated thing. Unlike this massive population of neutrophils and monocytes that's within the blood, if you look at two different helper T cells, they're not going to necessarily be the same. Whereas the neutrophils and the monocytes, they're all the same. They all do the same thing. They all attack any old pathogen. They all have exactly the same attack mechanisms. They're not specific to any pathogen. Whereas if we look at all the different helper T cells, they all have different little pathogens that they want to attack. It's absolutely amazing. It's what makes the adaptive immune system complicated to understand, but also absolutely thrilling to understand. Okay, so you have a huge number of helper T cells, and they are all directed against different pathogens. So how does this work? Specifically, all your separate little helper T cells, they have a little fragment of a protein that they are directed against. And this fragment of a protein could be from a protein of a pathogen, and therefore that helper T cell would be directed against that pathogen. So, every helper T cell, and I'll draw this here, has a little peptide fragment, a little combination of amino acids. So remember, proteins are made up of polymers of amino acids, amino acid after amino acid after amino acid, all joined together in a great big long chain. So a little fragment of a polypeptide, so a little sequence of amino acids, each of these helper T cells will be directed against a specific little peptide fragment, so a specific combination of amino acids. So, important terminology here. We refer to this as a peptide fragment. So, all of the helper T cells within your body, they all have a little peptide fragment that they are directed against, and which they absolutely loathe with a passion, okay? And which they could initiate a huge, great immune response against. Now, the idea, of course, is that you have loads of different helper T cells, all directed against different peptide fragments, and the idea is that the peptide fragments that you have helper T cells directed against should not appear in any of your own proteins. So if we look at all the proteins within your body, you can chop up the proteins of your body in loads of different ways to get loads of different peptide fragments. Those peptide fragments that you can get from self-proteins, they should not be peptide fragments that you have helper T cells directed against. You should just have helper T cells that are directed against peptide fragments that don't appear anywhere in any of your own proteins. That at least is the principle of how the population of helper T cells should work. Of course, in autoimmune diseases, that's not going to be entirely the way that it actually happens, unfortunately. But ideally, all of your helper T cells should be directed against peptide fragments that do not appear in any of your own proteins. They should just be peptide fragments that could potentially appear in the proteins of pathogens. And if you have a pathogen that has a protein with a peptide fragment for which one of your helper T cells is directed against, you could use that helper T cell to attack that pathogen. And indeed, you could initiate an adaptive immune response in that way. So, you have a massive, great population of helper T cells within your body. All of them are directed against peptide fragments. So they all have a unique peptide fragment that they are directed against. And the peptide fragments that they are directed against should not appear in self-proteins. In order for us to get an autoimmune attack on a protein of the central nervous system myelin, of course, what's going to have to happen for some reason in our individual, in our man over here who's going to develop multiple sclerosis, he is going to have to develop an adaptive immune system where he has helper T cells within his body that are capable of attacking peptide fragments within the central nervous system myelin protein. So let me just write this down here. So we are trying to explain why this individual is going to be able to attack a protein of the central nervous system myelin. And of course, we don't know the identity of this protein, so we'll just call it the central nervous system myelin protein. And we'll represent it as, a little box here. So this box can represent the central nervous system myelin protein. So in order for him to be able to attack this protein, he's going to have to develop CD4 positive T cells that are directed against, at least one of these CD4 positive T cells that's directed against a peptide fragment of this myelin protein within the CNS here. Okay, so that's one of the things that's going to happen in this individual that won't happen in someone who's not going to develop multiple sclerosis. And it is absolutely essential that you get both a CD4 positive T cell directed against this central nervous system myelin protein and also B cells, because without the CD4 positive T cells, the B cells can't actually attack. These work together. B cells can't do anything without CD4 positive T cells. And if you're not familiar with the way the adaptive immune system works, don't worry, I will explain this later on about how these are necessary for these. So, at the moment, let me summarise what we've seen so far. So we are trying to justify what's going to happen in the body of our man here who's going to develop an autoimmune attack on this central nervous system myelin protein, whether that's a form of multiple sclerosis or whether it's going to be a clinically isolated syndrome. And what we have seen is that it's fundamentally going to be a problem with the adaptive immune system. We've seen that the adaptive immune system consists of these two major populations of cells, T cells and B cells. We've talked about how T cells are divided into these two populations. We've said we don't care about the CD8 positive T cell population as far as multiple sclerosis is concerned, so we won't discuss those any further. We've talked about the CD4 positive T cell population. We've talked about the fact that you have a massive, great population of helper T cells, and all of these helper T cells are directed against slightly different peptide fragments, and that in the ideal world, you should only have helper T cells that are directed against peptide fragments that do not appear in self-proteins. However, in order to get this autoimmune attack, this individual, for one reason or another, and we'll discuss later on what might be influencing the development of the immune system, for one reason or another, he is going to end up developing CD4 positive T cells that are directed against a peptide fragment of this protein from the central nervous system myelin, and this is going to allow us to initiate an adaptive immune response against the central nervous system myelin protein. Now, another thing to add about T cells is that you do not continuously produce these throughout your life. They are produced firstly in your bone marrow, and then they have to go to the thymus gland to be produced. So this is really important to understand. Neutrophils and monocytes, they're very cheap cells. The body produces loads of them every day. The bone marrow produces loads of them every day. We're continuously replacing them. It's very, very easy to build the innate immune system, whereas building the adaptive immune system is very, very difficult. And indeed, you stop actually producing new T cells after you've grown up, basically. You're only producing your T cell populations when you're a child. And in fact, I want to introduce you to a new piece of terminology, something that's very important, a piece of terminology that's very important and which I want to use, so I'm going to introduce you to, is the concept of a T cell clone. So, if we were to look at this massive population of CD4 positive T cells within your body, I've discussed how each CD4 positive T cell is directed against a certain peptide fragment. Now, in that population, you will have some CD4 positive T cells that happen to be directed against the same peptide fragment. We would refer to those as the same CD4 positive T cell clone. Okay, so a clone of CD4 positive T cells is a collection of CD4 positive T cells that are all directed against the same peptide fragment. So in multiple sclerosis, this individual is going to develop a clone of CD4 positive T cells directed against a peptide fragment of this CNS myelin protein. Okay, so that's a piece of terminology that's very helpful to say. So very important to understand is that the clones of CD4 positive T cells, and indeed of CD8 positive T cells as well, but we're not interested in those, they're set once you're an adult. we're only developing new clones when you're a child, and that's because to develop new clones you need to be producing new T cells from the bone marrow. They then need to go to the thymus gland where they will mature, and then they can go into the blood and the lymphoid aggregates, such as the lymph nodes and the spleen. And after you have become an adult, the thymus gland atrophies away. It's no longer present. It's replaced by fat tissue. So the thymus gland is a gland that's usually behind the sternum in children, but in adults it's gone. And without it, you can't produce new clones of CD4 positive T cells. So I'll just put this here. So a gland that's extremely important in the production of brand new helper T cells is the thymus gland. So the bone marrow starts the production of T cells. They then have to go to the thymus gland for maturation, and then they can go into the bloodstream. And in the thymus gland, very important things are happening. In particular, you're making sure that you do not produce helper T cells that are directed against peptide fragments of self-proteins. Of course, that process is somehow going to go wrong when you develop an autoimmune disease, and we'll try and discuss factors that might be involved in that later on. And what my major message here, however, is that you're not producing new clones of CD4 positive T cells once you're an adult. Your immune system, as far as T cells is concerned, is set in stone once you're an adult. It develops once you're when you're a child. And CD4 positive T cells are extremely important. B cells, they're not set once you're an adult. You are producing new clones of B cells once you're an adult, but it doesn't matter if you're producing strange B-cell clones as an adult. If you haven't produced the CD4 positive T cells that will be required to make those B cells work as a child, it doesn't matter. They're never going to actually be able to do anything. So really, the adaptive immune system, here's the message that I've taken so long to tell you. The adaptive immune system is set in stone when you are a child. Your adaptive immune system develops when you are a child, and once you're an adult, it's set in stone, really, what types of adaptive immune responses you can initiate. So, once you are an adult, your thymus gland has atrophied away, so you are not producing any brand new T cells from the bone marrow and the thymus gland. So the question then is, how do you maintain your population of T cells? Do the ones that you have just live forever? Do they live for the rest of your life? And the answer is no. They do live for a long time, but they don't live your entire lifetime necessarily. The way that you maintain your population of CD4 positive T cells and CD8 positive T cells after the thymus gland is gone is that the ones that you do have gradually, very, very slowly, they divide, and they divide extremely slowly. And this rate of division is just enough to maintain the populations, to maintain the clones. So the rate at which T cells are dying equals the rate at which you are producing new ones through the division process. So, to spell out the full story, when you are a child, you produce brand new T cells from the bone marrow and the thymus gland of both the CD4 and CD8 type, and I should say CD8 positive T cells. They work the same way. They're all directed against a specific peptide fragment, even though we're not interested in those in this story. So, you develop brand new ones that can be directed against brand new peptide fragments, so you produce loads of different clones when you're a child. Once you are an adult, the thymus gland is gone and production of new T cells stops, so you cannot produce any more T cell clones. You can only maintain the clones that you have, and this is done by a gradual division process that makes up for the gradual loss of T cells as they die, but they do have a very long lifetime. So it's a very, very slow division process because the death process is a very slow processing for T cells. Okay, so that's T cells talked about. We'll have a break here, and in the next video we'll talk about B cells. We'll talk about B cell clones and the fact that in this individual who's going to develop multiple sclerosis, you're going to get B cell clones also directed against this central nervous system myelin protein.